everybody to Literary Merit, the second writing panel of our writing track, in which we are going to talk about, surprise, surprise, literary merit.
Yeah. Literary merit.
Save that for the comedy panel.
Yeah, sorry.
So, the first question, of course, would be, what is literary merit? But I think before we talk about that, let's go ahead and introduce ourselves. I am Horizon. I am going to be nominally moderating this. I am, as well as a fanfiction author and Everfree staffer. I also work with the Royal Canterlot Library, which is a fic review and author interview society that posts weekly interviews, royalcanterlotlibrary.net. So I will have plenty to say about the topic of what makes fanfiction good. Let's just go down the table.
I'm Paikopai. I'm the head of the writing track for Everfree Northwest. I have authored some fics, but I'm more famous for writing into Ponyville and editing other people's fics. And do you want the Squatch?
Yeah. Welcome, we just got started.
Sorry about that. I also host a YouTube site where we do some videos on writing, because sometimes people like to listen as much as read. They just learn easier when someone's talking to them. So if you want to check out Literary Pie, shameless plug.
Yeah, Literature Pie. Yeah. I'm Tony Genovese, also known as Gary Oak on fanfiction.net. What did you do, Pico? Oh, I didn't see you. Come on.
He was hidden behind the literary merit.
Yeah, literary merit. Yeah, I'm on Literature Pie as well as CCAT over there. I'm a pre-reader for the Royal Guard group on fanfiction, if you've ever heard of them. I've written a few stories. One's a pony novel that got me into fiction. I'm a creative writing major at university. I wrote a story called The Sundering that I ended up submitting to college for a writing class. And I also wrote a story about Scootaloo, which I ended up getting read by Scootaloo herself. I've written pony scripts for television scripts, and I have one fiction award to my name, but nothing in the fandom. So there you go.
I'm CCAT Mila, and I wrote a thing. I've been on fanfiction for about 2 years, and I have written a few shipping-type fictions. I really enjoy that. I'm also a member of the Literature Pie, as Gary mentioned. I've done a few videos on how to make yourself feel better when you don't get a lot of comments. I've done a few on how to know when it's ready to go, when you're ready to post. Things like that, because I want to make people happy and make them smile.
I'm Deskwatch. I'm an editor on fanfiction. I'm not an author, so putting that one out there now. But I have done pre-reading for a number of other ponies on fanfiction across a bunch of different stories, so that's why I'm here.
Right. So this is about literary merit in fanfiction. I guess the first big question is, can we talk about literary merit in fanfiction? We're writing stories about brightly colored ponies. At some level, though, I mean, I don't think any of us would be here if the answer were no. So, I mean, there is something which, we can talk about in terms of what elevates a story beyond just being words on the page. Anybody want to sort of start taking some stabs at that?
Well, I don't think the subject of the story really matters. What makes a good story is going to make a good story regardless of the particular genre we're writing in. So, and again, not as an author, but just as an editor, it doesn't matter if we've got characters that are in a universe that we know nothing about, or characters in a universe like My Little Pony that is very, very rich and well developed. If we can identify with the subject matter of the story, then it's still going to be a good story. So I think it absolutely applies.
You can make us care about them.
Mm-hmm. One point I want to make is, anyone here familiar with the works of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey? Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right, is anyone here familiar with the Aeneid by Virgil?
Which one?
The Aeneid by Virgil. It's basically the Odyssey except from the Trojan point of view, and that's kind of how Rome was founded. But if you look at it in a certain way, it's kind of like fan fiction of Homer. It was, it was written for, a different set of people. Yes?
What's it called again?
The Aeneid.
How do you spell it?
How do you spell Aeneid?
A-N-N-I-D.
There you go, yeah. It follows Aeneas, and he was one of the Trojans. It starts with Troy aflame. So, fan fiction has existed in one form or another for a really long time, and I think a lot of people would consider the Aeneid having a lot of literary merit. So, yes, pony fan fiction can have it as long as it's written well.
One of the big things that I think when you discuss this fan fiction habit is what are you trying to write? Are you trying to write a good story that just happens to be about ponies, or are you trying to write a pony story and then make it good? If you go in with the perspective of you're trying to write a good story and it happens to have ponies, I think you tend to have better stories, in my opinion. Follow Equestria, I really like. I know some people have problems with it, but even the people who complain about it still admit that it's got a lot of what's there in a good story. And the point of that was a story that happened to be about ponies. It wasn't like they set out specifically, I must find a pony story to write. And I think the perspective when you go into writing literature matters a lot. If you're going in, when I started writing fan fiction, I started writing to find out how my style would work, and pony fan fiction was a way of doing it. And that first fic was it was fun, but it wasn't a great story. And so a lot of people liked it, but you wouldn't call it like you wouldn't say it has a lot of literary merit. Since then, one of my stories, T, the Tiniest Troll, I set out, I had this story in mind that happened to be about ponies and a troll. It's called T, the Tiniest Troll. It actually has more views in Russian than English, because it, just didn't get out there as much and it's not complete. But a lot of people are saying, hey, this is like this author. I'm like, I've never heard about them, but they're, some famous author. It's like, oh yeah, it's a little bit like that. If you keep going, like, you could really, like, be a great author. I'm like, oh, this is really cool, because it's not just people saying they liked it, it's people saying that there was merit behind it. And so in my own works, I saw that as a huge difference between the quality of my writing.
Queuing off that difference between having pony stories that you want to improve and having literature that happens to be about ponies. One thing that the author Colden Gardiz writes time after time is stories about ponies are stories about people. And I think when you start approaching stories from a literary standpoint, that becomes doubly true, because you are looking at these things that you're reading as reflections on the human condition. And we are taking this very foreign world of brightly colored, pastel magical ponies, and using that to illuminate things that hit closer to home. So, yeah, that's.
No, that's a good, just in the general sense, that's a good indication of why this fandom, I think, has gotten so popular. In that we see in the characters things that we know are good qualities that we should all have, and maybe, none of us are perfect, but maybe we see something in them that we think we should have, and so we kind of use them as the mirror to see what we need to have. And that's what makes us connect with them on that emotional level that makes a good story. And so I know personally when I read stuff, I tend to favor longer stories with well-developed emotional, well-developed characters that you can identify with, rather than the short one-offs that a lot of people write. And I'm not saying there's anything bad with those. It's just it's hard to, in a 3,000-word story, to build a character that you can really, really identify with. When they're happy, you're happy. When they're sad, you're sad. So on and so forth.
That's one of the reasons I don't have that many fics, is because I focus so much, and I try to make sure I focus that much on what the characters are feeling and what they're doing, and being able to show that. There's a better word for it, I'm sure. Project.
I think with literary merit, there just has to be something about that story that you can kind of take away from, and maybe it changes your views on something, it makes you think, because...
More than just entertainment.
Yeah, exactly, because some stories are just entertainment, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's, it's a type of escapism, it's a lot of fun, it's a way we keep ourselves entertained. We as humans love stories, we're natural storytellers, but sometimes, literary merit it's got something more to it. It's really hard to describe.
And when you're talking about strengths, a great example, if you guys are here a little bit past the convention, is the EMP has a great thing right now on fantasy where they talk about, they have interviews from a bunch of different famous authors, and one of the things that they talk about a lot is world building. There's a thing on world building, and some people, it's all about the world building. Tolkien, you read it for the world building. You don't necessarily read it because you actually start off caring about the characters. They're very similar. They're not very expressive. They're literally it's exposition of what they're feeling. You're not showing it. It's not show versus tell for a lot of it at the beginning. I've been trying to read it, and I don't like reading stuff like that. But I keep wanting to read it for the world. And I think Ponies has supplied a great world to build off of. And so the excellent work put in by Lauren Faust at the beginning basically set a stage where everyone, whether they're from the show or not, when they're coming up and they're building on it, they're building on a very full and flesh world and great characters. And so when you're writing, if you see a good pony fic out there, they're playing off of characters or the exposition or the wordplay. Wordplay is very common in a lot of, maybe it's not the most common in the writing, but people will be noticed for having some really interesting wordplay in some of their fics every once in a while.
And it's not even that, just building on the world in general, because you end up with stories like of Skies Long Forgotten, that it's all, the whole story is about the Pegasus Empire pre-Equestria, before the three tribes even meet. And so they're using the lore from a world that's so rich that isn't in the show ever. I mean, it's touched on very briefly, but it's never really addressed. But we can still build on that because it's such a great world to build off of. And because of that, we can get stories that are worth taking our time to sit down and read. And they're 70,000 word stories, and we still sit down and read them. That's almost a tiny novel. So.
Yeah, talking about that world building that the show has done right, I think actually is almost a great place to start, because when you're talking about literary merit, I mean, we can analyze the show in the same sort of way that we can analyze fan fiction. And one thing, I mean, even from the very first episode that caught me about My Little Pony was the arc you have with Luna and Celestia. Here you are introducing this show where you have this being of light and this being of darkness, and you have this very traditional sort of, almost Judeo-Christian sort of, God and the devil sort of mythology, and then from the very first minute or two of the show, they invert that, and the idea is that you have this sister who is banished and then redeemed, and that right there is something that you do not see in a lot of Western literature.
Especially kids you see got a fight and we made up, but you don't see like this character portrayed as being bad actually being brought back to being good.
Yeah. And I mean, some people would say, that's what makes it a children's show, but here is something that we are presenting, that Hasbro is, the Lauren Faust is presenting as something that is worthy of moral note, and that is something that has a lot of impact. Are there other things in the show that you guys have taken note of as being especially deep? Or?
The thing that actually got me into the show was I'm like, ponies, and I watched it because a friend is like, well, you should see this, and I'm like, well, you should see this other thing. It was like some anime, I don't even remember what it was, and so I started watching ponies. Like, you know what? This isn't bad. That's the first thing that caught me about ponies. Is, whether or not the animation, it's like, it's okay. Like, I kind of like it. Okay, like the first song with Pinkie Pie, like, you know what? There's some self-humor in there. I like that. And there weren't like a lot of things I didn't like. I mean, like the way the world was designed, the characters, the fact that they all seemed to be a little bit different. I mean, it wasn't bad, and so I gave it a shot. And then that's when I got hooked. Was I started watching it on my own, in addition to the first 2 episodes, and then you just keep getting more and more into it. So there's something to be said, not necessarily about grabbing the reader on the first page, but and getting them completely enthralled, but getting it so that they read a little bit more, and then they read a little bit more. Well, if you've already read 5,000 pages, what's 10,000 more? If you've already watched an episode, watched 3 episodes, what's 4 or 5 more? And then every once in a while you have an episode that I don't like, but I didn't see that until like season 2. There's like 1 episode I didn't like, and then No, actually, I despise Less Than Zero.
Yeah.
It bothers me so much.
I'll hold him down, you guys beat him.
It made me so sad, and then, but that's not the point. I mean, I can forgive that because so much of the rest of the stories are good that, you know, there's one story in season 2, there's one story in season 4 that I don't like. Whatever. It's no reason to stop the show. I mean, if you had started with that, I wouldn't have liked it. So there's something to be said about a story that starts strong and also ends strong, I would say, is the most important thing of a story.
Yeah, even if there's a couple of hiccups along the way, I mean, Daring Don't, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but if a story ends at its highest point, its best written, the readers will remember that, and they'll leave a really good impression.
Anything else the show has done right you guys have appreciated? Yeah.
I like the villains. I would have to say Magical Mystery. Because even though it was very well paced, it was obviously built up to something. That was probably kind of how.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue that the best thing that it's done is, again, provide that mirror of stuff that we need to have as just good people to interact with other people. But on the flip side of that coin, we've also got a bunch of other things that it's done really well in, for example, building such a rich world without actually putting it out there and saying, this is the entire thing. We're sort of left bits and pieces. We're given bits and pieces, and we're sort of left to run with that as well.
And then they give us something like a map, and we go crazy. And then we're like, why hasn't this appeared in the show yet?
Right.
It's on the map.
And there's
Right.
there's ways you can feel like that's actually there. Like, you know, there's history we don't know about.
Mhm.
I really like that.
Yeah.
It's a world it's lived in.
Yeah, you just feel the depth of the series.
Yes, sweetie.
You guys mentioned a couple times that the show would provide a mirror, or good stories, good literature will give us something to take away from it. Do you think that in order for something to have literary merit, that it needs to have, maybe this isn't the right way to phrase it, but it needs to have some sort of moral instruction? Do you think that for literature to be good, that is a facet of it that it must have, and if it doesn't have that, then it's not good literature? Because I just curious.
Well, I mean, I'd say it certainly helps, but
I don't think it's strictly necessary, but again, it definitely helps because I've read a bunch of, and this is going back to Ponyfiction specifically, I've read a bunch of little tiny short, 1 or 2 or 3,000 word one-offs that have no real purpose. They're just good for a laugh, and that's fine. They're a good little distraction, but they're not the stories that really stick in my head and really make me stop and think about stuff. So it's not entirely necessary, but at the same time, it's the stories that hit you in the gut, so to speak, that really stick with you. The ones that, they'll make you cry, they'll make you laugh, that kind of stuff. So, because at the end of the day, we are emotionally driven creatures, so.
And again, you don't have to set out to do that from the start, because sometimes that doesn't always work out. You can put too much in there and it doesn't come out the way you want, but
It might be too obvious.
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
well, I would say that a story with literary merit is one that teaches you something, and it's not necessarily going to be a moral lesson. For example, the most recent feature for the Royal Canterlot Library, which just went up this morning, is a story named Run. And the main strength of that one, which got it its feature, was the quality of the narration, the way that it used language. Present Perfect said in his quote in the review, for example, that it's like every word that it tosses is like a knife and just hits right on target. And so something like that can teach us about the way that language can be used to better effect. That's not necessarily going to come as a moral lesson.
Way in the back.
Yeah. Well, super. You've had your hands up for a while.
You've been very patient.
Yes.
So the damn description says you will discuss and dissect some of the fandom's greatest works.
Yes.
I'd like to ask each of you, what are some of your favorite pony fiction stories and why? What makes them work so well?
That's a good question.
Excellent.
Biblical Monsters, because I edited it and it starts funny more every time it's mentioned.
I'm gonna actually think about that and pass it on real fast.
I have a serious answer for later to go back down. So.
I was actually planning to bring this up later. Skyrider's Princess Celestia Hates Tea is one of the ones that I bring up at every chance that I get, and it's a comedy, but I think there's a lot of literary merit in it, in which I will cover when I get a chance to return.
The Sisters Do by Ponky. I really enjoy that one because of the adventure and the different kind of way he portrays both Daring and Ditzy. And I love the fact that they're sisters. I love that it's about their relationship. I really enjoy that. I like the contrast, or the how it shows what's happening in the current story and how what's happening in the book that is being read by Rainbow and Ditzy and whoever else is reading it, the kids, the Cutie Mark Crusaders. I really enjoy that, and that's why I decided to do some of the audiobook for it.
I would say, there's so many to choose from. One of my favorites is Light the Sky on Fire. And it's a story about Scootaloo learning to fly, but the reason I liked it is it expresses not only the emotional connection, but also a slightly more intellectual connection of a lot of the times when we do things in life, we do them because we want to do them, but we also have to understand why and how we do the things that we do. And so you get a deeper look at a character that everybody just brushes off. And you get to look at how they're different from everybody else. Everybody else, this stuff just comes naturally. Scootaloo, it doesn't. She has to really work at it. And so there's a lot of personal determination that goes into it in just trying to build the character up more. And so being able to see stuff like that, where you get this contrast between them loving what they do but not being able to do it, and then having to actually understand why and how they do it. So it sort of connects both halves of the character.
So for my serious answer to this question, Biblical Monsters is good. It does have a lot of literary merit, and I'm not just saying that because I edited it. But I haven't read too much pony fiction until recently because I've just been busy with school, busy with my own writing, but I decided to become a pre-reader of the Royal Guard recently. So I've been having to pre-read a lot of stories, and by far the best one that I've pre-read is Evan Main's Tired, and it's reduce the semicolons by about 3/4, then we're posting it. That's the only reason why it's not up yet. It is so good.
I'll get to it.
It's basically set way in the future, told from Pinkie Pie's perspective, and it has 2 huge punches in the gut that are just really good. And it's just very well crafted. You can tell by the prose. It's very exemplary. I would highly recommend it, especially after it goes up on DRG's next post if it's fixed. Tired.
So I'm actually going to tie the last 2 questions together because one of the things that was asked was the moral, like does there have to be a moral behind every story? Every story, even if it's unintended, somewhere in it will have a moral. Whether it's even just showing someone in a positive light because they're being nice. Like, oh, look at this nice person, this good thing happened to them. It comes off as there always being a moral. And the thing about a good story is that if you get the reader really into the story, it doesn't matter what moral you put in there, they will find a moral that they feel is reflected in the story that they think is important. And that, I mean, I have a psychology degree, and that's just what people will do. They'll find something that they like about something, and a lot of times even they'll overlook things that they dislike if it's something that they like otherwise. Now, as for my fic, I would say The Keepers of Discord, because that's one of the few fics that there's like 3 chapters, and I can't remember who. Do you remember who wrote it? Asylum? No.
Yeah.
That sounds right. Hoopie McGee. Hoopie McGee.
We actually featured it in the late.
I know, and that's why it came to mind. And that's when I read that. I actually read it through twice. Both times, multiple times each chapter, I'm smiling and crying at the same time. You get so emotionally invested in the character that you know, I mean, I can find a moral in it, but honestly, it breaks my rule of the ending. My personal rule of the ending needs to be the best part of the fic to truly make it a great fic. But it's really close, and the rest of the story, like where the climax is, and I won't ruin it for anyone, but it's very obvious what the meaning of the story is. I mean, it's a fairly straightforward meaning, like, be nice to people. Like, that's all the real story, like, reader story meaning you can get from it. But the investment you have in the characters, you're looking at everything, every single word you get invested in, and you want there to be more. Even when the story ends, you recognize it as being a nice, solid ending, and you still want just more to have been in the fic. But you know that if there was more, it would ruin it. Like, when the reader's torn, that's when you know you have a really, really good fic.
Yeah, Up Sky's Long Forgotten is a good example of that too, in that he was the author.
I am not 24. I'm a liar. I just
But it's a good story, and especially for someone, I guess maybe I've got a bit different perspective on having been in the military and been in combat, but there's parts of that stories where it's like, I actually found it difficult to read because of personal experiences I've had in my life and some of the things that I've seen, but at the same time, you can't stop. It's that well developed that you get sucked into it and you literally can't put it down, or at least I couldn't. Even though it's like, I'm reading it through tears going, I can identify with this on a very personal level. But at the same time, I can't, I want to walk away from it, but I can't. So you run into that as well when you write a good story. So.
Meanwhile, my fellow this completely strange changeling has had his hand up for a while.
So I'm a literary studies major, and I'm breaking into fanfiction. I've written short stories before though. This sounds a lot like literary fiction versus pop fiction or commercial fiction. And as I'm trying to decide how I want my story to be, should I take it more to the literary side, being that I do have some, or you do have some great
Target audience. Who are you writing it for?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're writing it for people like us who way overthink things, go more towards the in-depth literary stuff. If you want to write a short story that's maybe a comedy, or to test your waters in the pony fan fiction. I mean, comedy, honestly, random comedy, like if you're new to fan fiction and you just like, I'm not going to be very good, but I want to get something out there, I want it to be fun, random comedy is great for that. But what you're trying to do is different based off of your target audience.
So you have to analyze, what does your story want to be? Because sometimes you set down to write a story like, this is going to be a novel, but it ends up being a short story or even a film or something. You don't know what it's supposed to be, so you have to kind of let it grow, and sometimes stories will say, hey, I am a piece of literary fiction, please write me as literary fiction. And if you're sensitive to that, then you can form it as such. Just have an idea and cultivate it and see what it becomes.
Know what kind of dinosaur you're making.
I'm actually going to dissent a little bit here because I think that literary merit is something that is independent from popularity. That you can write a story that is good and it also becomes popular. It's a little bit harder because you're juggling two balls instead of just one. The fact that you are building layers in does not stop you from telling a story that will hook people in. And we'll have other panels like Making the Big Time, for example. We'll talk about what makes a story popular. That was a very popular one last year, and we're looking forward to doing it again.
Sometimes you just get unlucky, and even if you have an objectively fantastic story, it has like 50 views. It just happens. And sometimes there's a bad story that gets like a bazillion, and sometimes there's a really good story that has a bazillion.
There's a reason why you oftentimes see authors saying, I have no idea what happened. Like, I wrote this and I spent a month on that fic, no one read it, and no one liked it. And I spent an hour on this one, and everyone loved it. And what's popular is a lot harder to determine than what is good, actually. Well,
I'm also a big advocate of just write what you want to read.
Asylum.
I actually noticed
I know that's
that
helpful.
a lot of the
Sorry.
best stories that get popular remain so because the author just ignores the fact that it's popular. Not a great example, but a decent example of this is Paradise by Slywood. That's been up for like 2-3 years now. We started writing on DeviantArt and blew up when she got into fanfiction, but she hadn't really changed anything.
Well, and DeviantArt is unfortunately not a place to really find and follow fan fiction unless you're finding a fan fiction of an artist that you follow.
Yeah, but I mean, in some sense, if you're giving the audience explicitly what they want, you're not writing the way that you're invested in it, and I think that kind of takes you out of the story as author a little bit.
Yeah,
DeviantArt's actually where I tested mine.
what I was trying to say.
Well, here's one example. Do you know how many times the creators of Ponies just sort of like looked at fan requests and just kind of laughed and just sort of did their own thing anyway? And look at I mean, we just had Dragon Ball Z at the end of season 4. Come on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think they should do that. They should listen to us and then take what ideas we give them and kind of incorporate in the show.
If it works.
Gary Jones for an example of when they shouldn't.
I think the
I think there's
fandom
a
actually
story
does a
of
better job of the show than the show does in a lot of respects. You have to filter through to find the really good parts, but I mean, if we have 100,000 or what is it, 65,000 stories on fan fiction now, some of them are going to be better than the show. They just are, just by statistics.
Yeah, well, and there's an aspect of that too, in that in writing a story, you can make it much, much longer than you can cram into a 22-minute cartoon. And so
Or
an
shorter.
author that's writing can do a 200,000-word story that is just as entertaining as that 22-minute episode, but it's much, much grander in scope and much more detailed. So,
Yeah.
We're also not writing for 5-year-olds.
Yeah. The thing is, as someone who's actually written spec scripts for My Little Pony, like I've actually had to write the 22-minute episodes to the structure, to the by the numbers, and it is actually a very difficult thing to do, and it's night and day between the stories. And I actually wrote a Scootaloo episode where she gets feather flu and ends up failing really hard at a competition, and like a ball kicking competition, and the thing is the episode where the flag waving one, you remember that flag waving on the Scootaloo and like her difficulty flying and all that sort of came into play? That came out like a few weeks after, and my friend just said, I like your version better. But it's actually a really hard thing to, like, screenwriting is just difficult, trust me.
Have you heard the story of when Pixar was first pitching Toy Story? And they originally wrote it, they got all these notes from Disney that was just like, you know, make it edgier, make it more adult and stuff like that. And they took all the notes and they put them in because they figured, well, these guys know what they're talking about.
ruined the movie.
It sure did. They showed the preview and the Disney people hated it. And they were like, what were these people doing? And they're like, they were listening to your notes. So it's take the notes, but take what you can take from it, but don't just go straight up and,
Well,
do
and
what you want.
the flip side to that is take the notes, but also at the same time, don't be afraid to do what you know is right. Because in that example, what ended up happening, what most people don't know is what ended up happening is after they did all of that, when they went back, Steve Jobs actually had to go back to Disney and said, look, either you're going to let us do this because that's what you hired us to do, or we're walking away from it and you can have this piece of garbage. And Disney went, all right, you clearly knew what you were doing when we hired you, so we're just going to let you have free reign. And we ended up with the movie Toy Story, so that we know and love today. So
There's the phrase, too many hands in the kitchen, too. I mean, you can have as many great people as you want working on something, and the more you add, the harder it is to keep everything together, because you'll just have maybe a comma, maybe a word here, word there. It slowly will start to dissolve and unravel. The way humans work is we're usually, we operate really well in groups of 2 to at most 15. Now obviously when you're doing something like fan fiction, if you have 15 people writing it, it's not going to work. But when you have a big project like Toy Story, well, I mean, there's a reason why a lot of TV shows will only have 1 or 2 writers for sitcoms and stuff like that. It keeps it consistent. It keeps it evolving along the same line, because we've had plenty of episodes where they bring on new people and it feels like it's a step back. But then the next episode, it feels more up to speed, and it's just getting used to the process that they go through on the show, getting used to writing the different characters, seeing how the episode turns out. Because once you write it, you don't have any input. I mean.
And meanwhile, back to fanfiction though, I think Evan was wanting to chip in.
Yeah, along the lines of people giving feedback, I've heard some author, I don't know exactly who, said when someone tells you something is wrong with your writing, they're usually right. When they tell you how to fix it, they're usually wrong.
Yeah. Very true.
One of my screenwriting professor said that 90% of what you hear in a workshop is crap. Just completely useless.
Is this a workshop?
No, a workshop is
We
when,
just finished one of those.
Yeah, it's when you discuss a story and then you go around, do like a round table thing saying, this is what I like, this is what didn't.
That 90% statistic was part of the 90%. Wrap your brain around that for a little while. Yeah. Okay. Well, we did promise in the con book that we would discuss and dissect some of the fandom's greatest works and learn how to apply those lessons to our own writing. So I think we can actually sort of pivot from here and actually start trying to talk a little bit more concretely about the literary merit. I was going to suggest that we start with a story that pretty much everybody has read. Let's just show hands around the room. Who has read My Little Dashie? Yeah. Okay, well that's what I thought. Oh, okay, keep those hands up. How many people here think My Little Dashie was a good story? Losing about half. How many people think My Little Dashie has literary merit as we would discuss it? I'm seeing, okay, I'm seeing hands. There are some brave people out there in the audience. Very good, okay. So,
names.
Yeah. But so here's the thing though, is that we can learn from stories that, I mean, this is still a story that can teach us lessons because My Little Dashie is popular. It is far and away the most read thing, like by a factor of 10, out of any story on fanfiction.net and any story in the fandom. And so I think this is, an example here that what makes a story popular is not necessarily what makes it good. We have a lot of people, in this room who have read it and, did not care for it. So what is it that My Little Dashie, let me throw this out to my fellow panelists. What is it that My Little Dashie is doing right that has gotten it that attention? Because, clearly people are picking it for some reason.
Feels.
Yes.
Feels.
Yeah.
It's a great
Strong
intro
feels.
fic into fan fiction, especially for this particular genre, and it was the first to do what it did.
Yeah, got there first. But if you want literary merit, just take what My Little Dashie did and do the opposite. It's like what my professor did.
So wait a second, are you saying she leaves the Ponyland to go live with a strange human in a box?
A
and so-
strange human, they find him in a box. And
It's like what my prof did. Like for a first year script writing class, he actually sat his entire class down and made them watch Tommy Wiseau's The Room. And he said, "This is how you don't write for movies. Just do the opposite of that."
Oh, hey, Mark.
oh, hi,
I
Mom.
actually haven't
I think I
read it,
just killed the panel, I'm
and that's
sorry.
because I've seen enough things about it that I'm like, yeah, I have no interest in reading it. And so there's that aspect of it too, is that it's very popular, but at the same time, it's so many people have read it and commented on it that I'm like, I don't even have any desire to read it.
There was another, I was wondering, have you guys ever heard the nostalgia critic?
Have we heard of the nostalgia critic? Yes.
I don't know. Who's that?
He wrote, he actually reviewed, it was an animated TV special that had very bad writing, very bad animation. It was about, he did it at the end of just after Christmas. He reviewed an animated special called Christmas Tree.
Yes, I've seen that one.
That's another bad example of bad writing.
Yeah.
Bad writing.
The Star Wars Christmas special.
Oh my god. I have PTSD from that review.
Yeah. Yes.
I think what My Little Dashie does right is that it evokes an emotional response in the people reading it. And I think what it does wrong is that the only people that could possibly get an emotional response out of it is the Brony fandom, the people that it's popular with. It's not at all universal. It's just that we happen to be the type of people that, as a big group,
that might identify with.
Yeah, and that's a perfect pivot. Is My Little Dashie gets the feels right for a lot of its readers, not all of its readers. What can we learn from that? About how can we write feels in a way that makes a story great.
Things that are different and things that are the same are two things the human brain really responds to. When you see sad fics, even if it's not ponies, but where someone has a loved one and they lose it, your brain will slowly train itself to, as it sees this, it'll start evoking the emotions that you had in the previous story and the previous story. That's how you get romances and sad stories that build, like, people who read this book now read this book, and they're completely different authors, and it's even more feels, but that one's always their favorite. And then when you do something slightly different, like Dashie did, where the main character found Dash, then it changes it up a little bit. It's also new and interesting. So now you have the same old feels that your brain is conditioned to, but it's new and interesting, so you pay more attention. And you see a lot of things that end up being both popular and have literary merit have those traits.
And I don't really remember who said it, but someone was talking about how even with some stories that you don't necessarily connect with as much, you could still find yourself having a response, because even though it may not be the character you're sad about, you're thinking about someone who reminds you of that character. Like, it's not that dog that died you're sad because your dog died.
Well, one of the definitions I've heard of what is literature is something that is still worth talking about in 100 years' time. Obviously, none of us have the time to wait that long before we have written.
Yeah.
But I think the best example of this, and actually it's really applicable to the genre of fanfiction, is H.P. Lovecraft.
Mm-hmm.
At the time H.P. Lovecraft was writing, it was schlock. It was a dime store. It's essentially the literary equivalent of like a book you pick up at the grocery store. And but there are college classes now completely dedicated to his works, and a more miserable man you could not have found. But I think that sort of, but it has those themes in it, that sort of attachment to a very primal fear of something we can't know and can't possibly combat in any way, either intellectually or physically.
Yeah.
And so, because it has that universal theme of basic primal fear, as opposed to, in the context of ponies, sort of that friendship and unity is possibly the most valuable asset we possess. But it taps into that universal thing, and it's something that can echo through time.
And in that vein, I think, steering it back to My Little Dashie, the universal button that Dashie is hitting is love and loss. And it doesn't hit that for everybody because of the particular situation of the story, but you have here a guy who is getting close to a friend, and then at the end she goes away and half of your audience bursts into tears.
Well, and the flip side of that coin, and to kind of, I guess, restate it in a little bit different way, is there's, like I said, we're all emotional creatures, and so what gets us is emotion, and there's only two things in the world that will really motivate anybody to do anything, and those two emotions are fear and hope. And so, in all of those stories where we see great literary merit, be they pony or not, we have to see, ideally, both of those extremes, because one is useless without the other, but we have to see at least one of those two extremes at some level. So in the case of like My Little Dashie, there's not just loss, but there's also fear of, I would argue, fear of being alone, or fear of the unknown and what comes after this. But at the same time, there's also hope in that, will Dash actually choose to stay, or, so there's that aspect of it too at the end of the story.
She's getting her proper life back.
Right.
There's that sort of.
And so you hope that she'll do better in where she's supposed to be, but at the same time you fear what's going to come after that. And so we see that dichotomy of both of those emotions driving people.
Well,
and I think that applies, again, that's great literary stuff, regardless of whether it's pony or not. So.
Well, and with My Little Dashie, you also have at the very end the main character's like, he's sad, he's basically mourning the loss of his child for all intents and purposes. But at the same time, he pauses and he sees the pictures that were left that Celestia allowed to stay of him and Dash. And then he remembers all the good times. So now you have this, it's love, it's loss, but it's also these great memories that you've read about, and that even ones that are in addition, and it makes you think. And then he's like, you know what? My life has been around her for the past X many years, but I can go out and I can have just as close of a relationship with anyone else. And so it's not just, hope that things will be better. It's a very specific hope playing on a very specific fear, not just fear and hope in general.
And Tired was name dropped earlier. I think Tired does write a lot of the same things that My Little Dashie did right, without all the things it did wrong. So that would be the one I would recommend in its place, where you're dealing with Pinky having those sensations of loss and looking back, nostalgia in the same sort of way.
Yeah, the story it has the two high points. It's got the climax and then the falling action, but it has a really solid ending too, and those are the two punches in the gut. You'll know them when you see them. I won't spoil it though. It's only about 7,000 words, so it'll take you, I don't know, half an hour to read?
Yes, you should all read it.
Are you the author?
Yes.
I'm one of the guys who pre-read it for TRG.
Yes, I'm going to work on that.
What was the name?
Tired.
Tired by,
Haven't made.
can you pronounce that?
Evan May.
Evan Main.
Yes.
Tired by Evan Main, coming soon.
Yeah.
All the feels.
Okay. Any other thoughts, guys, on the My Little Dashie, the feels, etc.?
No, I think that particular.
I think you covered it pretty
Cover
good.
horse
Yeah.
has been rational. Of course.
Okay. Well, I can switch topics over to. I previously mentioned Skyrider's Princess Celestia Hates Tea, which is an extremely different, example of literary merit, because Princess Celestia Hates Tea. Just quick show of hands, who's read it before? More people than I expected. Very good. It's a comedy in which we discover that Princess Celestia, for the past millennium and more, has been faking her love for tea, and the truth comes out. So here we have something that is going for laughs. It is a comedy. It is not a tragedy. It is not evoking the feels. It is evoking the funny bone. And yet, I think there's a lot of literary merit into it, because you take this silly premise, and then all of a sudden, halfway through, it stops and it almost deconstructs it. You look at this idea that she has been lying to her subjects for 1,000 years, and that falls apart, and all of a sudden, we see the damage that the truth is doing. And that leads to some very big questions about, what does responsibility mean?
The
What
destruction of an entire socioeconomic structure. Yeah, that was great.
Well, and it comes from something that we've all had to deal with, and that's social expectations. I mean, we've all had our family, been with our family at a time when we're like, well, I'm supposed to be here with my family, but, Uncle Benji, he's, not having a good day, and he might be, having a little bit more drink, or he might be a little bit more raucous or something, and it's just making something, not enjoyable that's supposed to be. But, if you're the good niece, nephew, wife, husband, daughter, grandparent, whatever, you stay there, like, yeah, Uncle Benji, yep, yeah, heard that story before, yeah, no, don't touch the dog. It's the kind of thing that we've all had to deal with, but we don't ever talk about really in a larger sense.